Do you fear death?
No, I don't. Not at all. I look forward to it. I don't look forward to the act of dying, but I look forward to what's on the other side. And I'll mention in this context that my partner of 25 years, Christina Hardy, she died last spring. She was a psychonaut like myself. She had had many deep experiences. She had no fear of death. And the two of us have no fear of death because she had gone to where she would be going when she died. She had personal familiarity with it, and she knew that it was a place of great blessing, great beauty, great joy. When you understand, and I don't mean just intellectually, but understand and had deep communion with these deeper levels of reality that on the other side of time space reality, then approaching death is not a dirge of sadness or mourning or just grief and loss, but rather it becomes a celebration of a life well lived. Christina had lived her life very well. She had risen to the challenges of her life, and her last years with me were some of the best years of our marriage as we move towards her death. And I expect that to be true for me too. I don't have any fear of death. And in fact, I just have to be patient because for me, my belief is, my understanding is that at the very least, when I die, I'll be able to go back to some of the deepest places in the universe that I had access through my psychedelic work because I know the address, as Robert Monroe would say. You can go anywhere where you know the address, and I know the address of these places. And if I can go back to there, then I know I'll be able to go on even deeper from there. So, no, I have no fear of death at all.
Okay, Chris, welcome to the show. Now, between 1979 and 1999, shortly after starting your career as a university professor, you decided to take LSD 73 times in a carefully planned, therapeutically structured sessions. I have to start the conversation by asking, why and what motivated this. This is a very unique experiment to put yourself through. So can you maybe just share a bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I had just finished graduate school at Brown University. I was a philosopher of religion. I was starting my teaching career. And in the first year, I met Ian Stevenson's work on reincarnation. That was a major pivot in my thinking. But more importantly, I met Stan Grof's work. I read Realms of the Human Unconscious, which had just been published a couple of years before. And I immediately saw the importance of Stan's work, not just for psychology and clinical therapeutic work, but also for my field, philosophy of religion. If what Stan was saying was true, then this was a methodology that would allow us to actually push the boundaries of consciousness systematically and glean philosophical insights into the structure of at least consciousness and probably reality, the actual reality that consciousness is perceiving. So I knew this work had to be done personally. It couldn't be done well from secondhand accounts. So I began this work, and I didn't expect it to last 20 years when I did it, but that's what happened. I worked for 4 years. I stopped for 6 years, and then I worked for another 10 years very intensely. And I chose to work in with high doses of LSD. Stan outlined in his early writings two protocols that they had used. One was low dose psycholytic therapy, peeling the psyche away gradually, layer by layer. Because of the time constraints of a dual career marriage and the difficulty of being able to plan a weekend for this entire session with children soon to come, I chose to work with high doses of LSD in a psychedelic protocol. And I worked at 500 to 600 micrograms. And this is a regimen that I don't recommend today. I do it differently if I were starting over again. But basically, I thought that I could consume my karmic baggage if I just took bigger bites out of it, working at these high doses. It turned out that I was applying a model of psychology and a model of the human psyche that was wrong. And so, because within 2 years, I was being drawn into experiences that were so deep and so broad, involving so many thousands of human beings, that I began to realize that my entire model of personal transformation, personal enlightenment, was too narrow to do justice to the states that actually unfold in these states. So for me, it was a professional and personal journey seeking to understand the deep structure of reality.
And what was it that caused that shift from the personal to the collective?
Well, after about 2 years in the work, I went through what Stan would have described as a classic ego death experience, culminating after 2 years of working at what he would call the perinatal level of consciousness, deep death. And I expected at that point for things to get easier. I expected to go more easily into transpersonal spaces. But what started immediately was a new cycle that ended up lasting another 2 years. I have to back up 1 second. My work always involved a cleansing portion of the session and an ecstatic portion of the session. So there was a purification, cleansing portion, which, if you navigated it well, would usually come to a crescendo, some type of death and release, and then the rest of the session was in an ecstatic state. So in this second stage of the work, after ego death, I began to have experiences of profound human suffering covering vast numbers of people and a vast number of years. And I was taken into it gradually, but systematically. Every session was getting deeper and wider and deeper and wider with more and more suffering. And eventually I had to realize that this was larger than anything that could be related to me personally. This wasn't some former life experiences. It wasn't simply what I wasn't drawing into my personal therapy content from the collective psyche that reinforced my personal ego death, because I really had gone through a very decisive ego death already. And that forced me, and this is the main theme of my book, Dark Night, Early Dawn, was to recognize that there is no strong boundary between the individual and the collective psyche. And when you work with highly energized states, as I was in using high doses of LSD, then if you work with high energy states, those energy states naturally expand to vast landscapes of the collective psyche. And literally, the patient in those sessions becomes not just you personally. The patient becomes some aspect of the collective psyche, that something was using my sessions to bring about some catharsis in some small portion of the collective psyche in order to drain the trauma that still resides within the psyche from human history, all the wars that we've been through, all the droughts, all the pain and suffering, all the violence to each other. Anything which is not resolved, by the time the individuals who experience it die, that pain congeals in the collective psyche and becomes a burden to the collective psyche's healthy functioning. So that's the theory that I presented in Dark Night, Early Dawn.
And what role do you feel healing individual suffering may may play in the bigger picture of the cosmos, do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think all of us essentially are cells within the macro intelligence, the macro consciousness of our species. And so any time one individual comes to a healing, goes through a healing process and engages some aspect of their personal shadow, personal history, I think that sets in motion a healing that radiates around the person 360 degrees. So we are all fractally embedded in this larger collective mind, this collective psyche, so that when we work intensely, that healing doesn't just stay within our personal boundaries, but it naturally radiates out and touches the healing of the entire species to some degree. And so if you actually work and you're experiencing collective suffering and collective healing, that's just taking it one step farther. But anytime one of us addresses, confronts, and heals personal trauma, then that has a positive uplifting effect on the collective psyche as a whole.
It makes a lot of sense. And something else I was curious to ask, is like you had to do this at a time when psychedelics were illegal, so very much in the dark. What was it like to sort of go between these two worlds on a regular basis, where you are, engaging with the sublime and then coming back to the mundane? What's that like as a person?
Yeah. Well, there are two aspects. One of them is engaging, as you say, the sublime and coming back to the mundane. But the other aspect was uh, being a university professor, teaching and doing the things professors do, but not being able to talk about my work to my colleagues or my students, never my students. Some of my colleagues knew what I was doing and we talked. Uh, but not at great depth because, for people who don't have deep experience with psychedelics, they simply can't understand. They can't follow what happens when you take a deep journey into that work. So it was a secrecy. I mean, I knew I had to do this in secret in order to do it because by 1978, 79, this was illegal. And I don't like breaking the law, but I felt that it was more important for me to use these substances, which would one day, I knew, become legal, to do them in this underground fashion. I found in the beginning it was fine, but I found that the longer I did this work, the more burdensome this secrecy became. And I found that if you create a persona which doesn't reflect your full integrity, it sets in motion pressures within the psyche. It's like it starts on the outside, but then eventually that discrepancy between who you really are and who you are pretending to be or who you're being socially, it begins to produce cracks within the human psyche. And I found that years down the road, it was becoming increasingly difficult for me to maintain that boundary between my private non-psychedelic life and my personal psychedelic life. And when I say it became more difficult, it means I'm a teacher. Students would ask me questions which I could tell was very important to them, but I could only answer them deeply, adequately, if I were drawing upon my psychedelic experience, which I was not allowed to do. And as a teacher, the desire to share knowledge and to teach, that created a tension with me because I had knowledge I was not allowed to share. The second part that you're talking about is the challenge of going into deep transcendent states and then coming back to your ordinary mundane condition, and then going back again into deep transcendent states and coming back into your ordinary condition. I want to say that I didn't have any difficulty psychologically, personally, going out and coming back. I seem to have a psyche. Not everybody does, but my system seemed to be comfortable losing its boundaries, opening up into transcendental spaces, and then coming back and congealing into my mundane space. And I made a serious effort to recall and remember everything that happened to me in those states. So I would write my sessions up within 24 hours. I'd hold them, capture them. I'd try to live by the teachings that were given to me. I tried to understand and comprehend things that were not comprehensible to me in the first stages. But if you go back over and over and over again, then they begin to make more sense. You begin to be more comfortable at these states. But in the end, I mean, as I went into the late stages of the work, in the last 5 years of the work, I did find it difficult to come back into ordinary mundane reality because at that time I was being drawn so deeply into the divine body of crystalline consciousness, into what I call diamond consciousness, so deeply into those realities that it just became very, very difficult to come out of those states and to come back into a state where I could remember them and I could understand them, but I couldn't access them again under my own power within my own human resources. That became a burden. Uh, and I didn't realize how much of a burden it became until after I stopped my work. It was after I stopped my work that I realized that I really was kind of overextended transcendentally, and I had to make a conscious choice to stay grounded in time and space, in my personal reality, and integrate what I had done rather than continue to go deep diving into the universe.
Wow. Wow. And was a conclusion that you took from that that there was a meaning to be found, a purpose to be found for your life in bringing the transcendent to the everyday?
There was, in several ways. First, again, I'm not a therapist. I'm not trained as a therapist, and I made the decision long ago to not become a therapist, even in the underground sense, but to function as a solo explorer, to try to be willing to push my system as far as I could, to go out as deeply as I could, and to try to understand what I was being shown in those conditions. So that satisfied a very deep philosophical need to understand. And as I have come to understand my past lives, I've done several years of past life therapy. I've uncovered a dozen or so of my former lives. And I began to understand that some of the experiences and some of the lack of understanding of how reality functions was transferred into this incarnation, and seeding my deep desire to understand how the world works. Why is there so much suffering? How can a benign and supremely intelligent source manifest a universe that is so painful and so difficult? What's going on here? Why is it this way? Have we done something wrong? Why is it this difficult? And now I think I have an understanding of that. And that was a primary drive to understand. And then the second drive is to share that understanding. But I wasn't really, and I did share that understanding indirectly in the courses that I was teaching at the university, courses in world religions, Eastern religions, Buddhism, comparative mysticism. But I wasn't able to share them directly as coming from these psychedelic visions until after I retired and after I began to write completely uninhibitedly, which I did in LSD in the Mind of the Universe. And when I began to do that and began to follow that into the world, this split that I had created in myself between the professor part and the psychedelic part began to heal, and it began to be merged until finally I can be my full and complete self in all circumstance.
And what was that like whenever you were able to sort of let your mind off a leash and just actually write about these topics that had been swirling around up there for decades?
Well, it was healing. First, it was a little scary. I mean, it literally, after I retired, it took me 3 years to get myself in a psychological space where I was willing to share this information, because I knew my colleagues would not be able to understand it or take it in. I knew I was writing for the next generation, younger people who would be coming along. But even so, to share your deepest, most intimate spiritual experiences with the world, that's like sharing your sex life. And it's very, very private. And it took me a while to be willing to let people that deeply into my life, because I'm a private person by nature. And eventually I came to this position of being willing to let people in by really, by understanding that these experiences were not given to me for myself. They were given to me to pass along to others to support them in their spiritual journey, in their explorations in life. And so I surrendered personal attachment to the story and then began the process of telling the story. It took me 5 years to write LSD in the Mind of the Universe. And the last chapter, which is about coming down the mountain, what happened after I stopped my sessions, was the longest chapter to write. It took me an entire year just to write that one chapter, because I really had to process everything that had happened to me in the 20 years after I'd stopped my sessions. So once I did this, once I went through this process, once I told the story, um, it felt good. It felt good to come out of the closet, because being in a psychedelic closet is just as damaging as being in any other closet where you have to deny something that's important to you.
For sure, for sure. And in your, a few things come to mind here, but for me, any time in my life when I've turned towards suffering and engage with suffering and seek to alleviate it, the experience is always meaningful. It always touches something deep inside that, yeah, I wouldn't say it feels good, but it feels right. It feels whole, you know. And I was wondering, you did mention there about, you've a really, you got the answers you were looking for with regards to suffering. Would you be able to just to comment on that and expand on that a little and share your thoughts here?
Well, first, just an observation on the process. Um, when you are confronted with suffering in psychedelic space, as in psychotherapeutic space, it's challenging. It's difficult. It's difficult to let that much suffering in. But as you say, it may not be fun, it may not be pleasant, but it feels like the right thing to do. And when you embrace your personal shadow suffering, there comes a point where eventually, once you integrate it all and you see what the source is and you confront it and you live with it, there's a certain falling away. The pain falls away, and there's a freedom which unfolds in its wake. And I found that to be true also for all the forms of suffering that surfaced on this journey. Even when I was going through that terrible collective suffering, the hell realms, you might say, and I felt that there was a meaning to this work, even though it wasn't personal meaning. It was personal in the sense that it felt like this is something that I was meant to do. And as I learned later down the road, that was true. That as I began to understand and was shown my purpose for this incarnation, a very significant part of it was this actual process of facilitating collective healing. When I went into this pain and allowed it to run through me deeper and deeper, eventually, after 2 years, it culminated in a crescendo of pain. And then it sort of spun me out into deep transpersonal places. It's when it spun me out beyond the entire human psyche into archetypal reality. And there were still episodes of suffering remaining, because what I found is that death and rebirth is a cycle. It goes round and round. And you don't die once when you die at the egoic level. That gives you access to a certain level of transpersonal consciousness. But if you keep pushing, then eventually you're going to come to a threshold, and you'll have to go through another round of dying, another round of suffering, in order to gain access to the next level of consciousness. And if you're systematic and you work at that level, eventually the same thing will happen. You'll go through yet another round of death and rebirth, and that'll take you into yet another level of consciousness where the rules of physics are different. The rules are just different. It's a different realm. I found that I learned to trust that process, to trust the process, that welcoming anything that happens, no matter whether you understand it or not, embracing the suffering that happens, always worked to my betterment. It worked to the betterment of beings that I'll never meet. But it also worked to my personal betterment because it allowed me to experience things that were important to me, that became important to me, that kind of ontological intimacy with the creative principle of existence was really important.
How is your inner experience of life now different after you've did this work compared to before? I know it's very difficult to put your own perceptions into words, but is there anything you could share there about what life is like for you on the inside after having been through such such incredible experiences?
Well, I don't consider myself an enlightened being. So let's just get that out of the way. I don't live in that kind of space. I think if I were seeking enlightenment in this work, I would have done it very differently. I would have done much lower doses. Enlightenment, as I understand it, is a condition of transparency to the ground of reality, which is always present, never changing, always there, living in communion, daily communion, minute by minute with this reality. And while I certainly touched things like that, my work really was different. It wasn't therapeutic healing, and it wasn't aimed primarily at spiritual awakening. I began to understand that it was aimed at cosmological exploration. I was trying to seek and understand larger and larger pictures of how the universe works. So the end result, once you do that, is it leaves you with a certain porosity, but not the same type of porosity that is enlightenment, classically said. It has left me calmer, more at peace. I understand reality more than I did before, more deeply. I understand reincarnation more deeply. I have an understanding of the cosmic processes that are involved in human evolution, where evolution is taking humanity, where reincarnation is taking humanity. There is a certain step back and enjoying the magnificent splendor of the universe around us, and also understanding with empathy, with compassion, the suffering that people go through so much. And I have a certain understanding of how that plays out in a larger evolutionary horizon. So there is a contentment. There's certainly a deepened compassion, uh, an understanding, a relaxation, uh, and a desire to be of use, just to be helpful, just to be of as much use to other people as I can in the time that's left to me.
That sounds pretty good. Um, do you fear death?
No, I don't. Not at all. I look forward to it. I don't look forward to the act of dying, but I look forward to what's on the other side. And I'll mention in this context that my partner of 25 years, Christina Hardy, she died last spring. She was a psychonaut like myself. She had had many deep experiences. She had no fear of death. And the two of us have no fear of death because she had gone to where she would be going when she died. She had personal familiarity with it, and she knew that it was a place of great blessing, great beauty, great joy. And when you understand, I mean, and I don't mean just intellectually, but understand and have had deep communion with these deeper levels of reality that on the other side of time space reality, then approaching death is not a dirge of sadness or mourning or just grief and loss, but rather it becomes a celebration of a life well lived. Christina had lived her life very well. She had risen to the challenges of her life. And her last years with me were some of the best years of our marriage as we move towards her death. And I expect that to be true for me too. I don't have any fear of death. And in fact, I just have to be patient because for me, my belief is, my understanding is that at the very least, when I die, I'll be able to go back to some of the deepest places in the universe that I had access through my psychedelic work because I know the address, as Robert Monroe would say. You can go anywhere where you know the address, and I know the address of these places. And if I can go back to there, then I know I'll be able to go on even deeper from there. So, no, I have no fear of death at all.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Yeah, I've heard you describe death almost as a homecoming, and that's a really interesting way to put it. Um, can you maybe tell us about the work of Michael Newton, and to what extent do you believe that we, before coming here, we consciously choose a particular life, a particular, let's say, cohort, a family, a people to come here with? What do you think? What do you make of that idea?
Well, I have found that to be true in my experience as I've come to know the deeper cause and effect patterns of my life. My first book, Life Cycles, was on reincarnation, in which I tried to integrate all the best available evidence for reincarnation that was available at the time. I did not know Michael Newton's work at that time. His came a little bit later. I like Michael Newton's work a lot. I respect his work a great deal. It rings true to me. It rings true to my own experience of the bardo in psychedelic states. It rings true to what I understand from the mystical traditions of the world, particularly Buddhism and their description of what happens to an individual when they die. His is more detailed. Another person that I would mention, if you want to understand the deep structure of the cycle going into the spiritual reality, coming back to time and space, into the circle, is Robert Monroe. Uh, he wrote three important books on the out-of-body state, his experiences out of body, and in his book Far Journeys and the Ultimate Journey, two books, Far Journeys and the Ultimate Journey, he gives a comprehensive description of what happens to us when we die. And I find it very congruent with Michael Newton's description. Now, on the choosing of our incarnation, I'm an educator, so let me bring an educator's metaphor to it. When children are starting their studies, we don't give kindergartners and first graders much of a choice in what they study. We say, study this. But as you go into high school, you have more choices, more freedom to choose. As you go into college and graduate school, you have a lot more freedom to choose what you're going to study. And I think it's something like that for the soul, too. It may be the case that in the early stages, things are arranged for you and you go where you're told by people who understand more than you do. But as you grow and as you learn, I think you have more freedom and more freedom to choose, so that by the time you have enough cycles of reincarnation under your belt, and I think most of us do by now, I agree with Michael Newton that we choose the life we are incarnating into, the people we are incarnating with. It's a group choice. The themes of the life. Now, Michael Newton says there is a place that you go when you are consulting with your spiritual guides, where you are given an experiential taste of the lives that they are recommending to you that you could choose. You can't see the end of it because the end is not written. You can get a sense of the beginning, and you choose whether you want any of these lives. You don't have to take these lives. You could go completely on your own recognizance and try to go it on your own. But most people are wise to take a choice from among the choices that are given to them. So my position is that pretty much today, There are no that everybody is is a volunteer. Everybody knows what they were getting into. There, we understand a much deeper understanding of history and an ability to see more into the future when you were in spiritual reality than when you were in physical reality. So my assumption is that we all knew what we were getting into. We all knew about this particular period of history and the intensity and the opportunities in this period of history. We chose together who we would be with and our former life companions, and then we jump in, and then we do our best, and then we die, and we return home, and then we remember the larger context of our choosing and the larger context of our life, and we see how we did, which things we handled well, which things we handled not well. We fold this learning forward, and then after a period of study and recreation and restoration, eventually the time comes where we make another choice to incarnate again.
A few things come to mind. If that's the paradigm that we hold, it seems that we can be a lot more patient with ourselves in this lifetime. And that doesn't mean complacent, but just realize, you're here to learn a specific set of lessons or experience a certain set of things, and to maybe let that process unfold maybe more organically and more naturally.
Yeah, I think so. Patient with ourselves and also compassionate with everyone else that we see. Because, and this was one of the great liberating things when I first shifted to thinking in terms of reincarnation, because in Western religions, there's so much of a pressure, like everyone, you got to cross the finish line before you die. Otherwise, you go to hell or something doesn't work well for you. But once you understand reincarnation, you realize not everybody's in the same class. Not everybody's trying to learn the same things. People are at different stages of a long evolutionary journey. And it just gives you more patience and compassion for people who are at very, very different stages of their journey than you are. Some of them are more advanced and working on more advanced themes. Some of them are less advanced. So it sort of suspends judgment. It just it judgment is not wise. It just traps you in your preconceptions. Patience and compassion. Yeah.
Yeah, something I heard you say, which I really liked, is that older learners help younger learners, and just because someone is a child doesn't mean they've a child's soul, so to speak. And an older person might have a, a child's soul. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's an interesting way to look at humanity.
Yeah. When I look at people, I don't see people so much anymore. I try to tune into souls, and souls are not necessarily the same age of the body that's holding them. Just as you say, there can be old souls in young bodies, young souls in old bodies. And this is what Michael Newton says in terms of the structure of postmortem existence. Older learners help younger learners. The whole system is set up so that older learners can help younger learners throughout the process.
I really like that.
Me too.
A person you mentioned earlier as well is the work of Ian Stevenson. Is there anything you feel would be particularly important to highlight about the research that he's done? Anything that might surprise people? What he's discovered in his work?
Well, I think of Ian Stevenson as a Charles Darwin of reincarnation. He has provided, I mean, reincarnation is an old idea. It goes back several thousand years, but he has provided empirical evidence that documents the continuity of memory, continuity of consciousness across lifetimes. His last great work on reincarnation in biology, he not only documents continuity of memory, but he also documents continuity of death trauma manifesting in the bodies of the next incarnation, so that somebody who is shot and he has medical records, or someone who has been hung, sometimes in their next incarnation, they have birthmarks or seeming scars on their tissue that relate to the trauma of the previous incarnation. See, I just think Stevenson's work and many volumes of his work, and this work is continuing by Jim Tucker at University of Virginia, really provides ample empirical justification, empirical evidence to justify the conclusion that reincarnation is not a matter of faith. It's not a matter, it's just a matter of empirical fact. It's something that nature has learned how to do. And it's a matter of collecting intelligence and rolling intelligence forward. Just as evolution rolls intelligence forward for whole species, at some point, nature has found a way to roll learning forward in individuals within certain species. So I think of reincarnation as a higher octave of evolution. It's the same impulse, the same developmental capacity, but now focused on consciousness and focused on individuals.
Just to underline how shocking it is what we're talking about here is, am I right in saying that he would have interviewed, say, children that would claim to have memories of a past life, and then one of these kids might have had a birthmark in a specific spot in their body, and then he would then trace details of that past life and find that the person might have been shot there, or if it was on the neck, might have been hung there. Is that what we're saying?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. His work focuses on studying young children from around the world who have spontaneous memories of their previous life. Now, there's some idiosyncratic characteristics of these children. Too long to go into the whole story, but basically they tend to reincarnate faster and closer to the life place of the first personality than the population at large. There are certain larger studies looking at the population at large, but these children who have verified memories of their previous life tend to reincarnate within 2.5 years of the death of the previous personality and within 50 miles of the life place of the previous personality. So they're coming in faster and closer to their previous personality. Most people, it's longer between lives and it's more distant between lives. So they're sort of an unusual subset, but they're cumulatively very, very strong evidence. It's just very hard to explain how these children can know what they know by any kind of ordinary conventional transmission of information or even super psi. It's just the most logical and simplest and powerful explanation is rebirth.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Um, can you tell us about this sort of up and out sort of philosophy that many religions and wisdom traditions hold, versus, I've heard you speak about the importance of maybe it's more about bringing your life to fruition. Maybe just tell us about this contrast.
Well, I think in general, and this is a broad generalizations, and there are some exceptions for especially spiritual teachers within these traditions, but basically, the religions of the axial age of basically the last 5,000 years have tended to adopt what I would call an up and out cosmology. That is, the goal is to achieve salvation or to achieve enlightenment, and then when you die, to leave the entire space-time system. So that in Hinduism, reincarnation is called moksha, which means escape. Escape not only from your personality, but escape from samsara, the cycle of rebirth. And this tendency tends to run throughout the popular versions of the religions, that the goal is not to stay on earth, but the goal is to go back to our spiritual home, to get there and to stay there. So your work results in a transformation of your person, and the reward is some off-planet paradise, whether it's Pure Land or the garden in Islam or heaven for Christians and so on and so forth. And I think this leaves a fundamental question unanswered. And the question is, what is the purpose of space-time in the beginning? Why is space-time here? Is it something that we're simply supposed to escape from? Is it a trial and tribulation? It is something that we've inherited because of a cosmic fall, the original sin. Um, and I think that might have made sense in the early centuries when we were still thinking the universe was relatively young, 6,000, 10,000 years old. But now that we understand how old the universe is, on this iteration, 13.7.8 billion years, and we don't know how many other explosions and implosions there have been, and how vast the universe is. And when we begin to really comprehend the enormity of the scale of creation, then it makes this idea that the goal is to finally reach some clarity about your self sense, to understand, to reach that part of your consciousness which is common ground with all living beings, so that what you are and what they are is the same essence. As the Hindus would say, Atman equals Brahman. As soon as you reach that, as soon as you mature enough for all the years of evolution and 5,000 years of writing and meditation, as soon as you reach that, then your goal is to get off the entire assembly line of time and space. And I think that to realize our transcendental nature, to realize these deep and profound truths, only takes us halfway in the creative intent. It's not simply to achieve escape velocity and to go into the spiritual bliss, but it's also to bring that spiritual bliss and to bring the power of divine creativity, which is your birthright, your nature at core, to fully actualize that inside time and space. Now, there are strains within the religions uh, which recognize that and hold that, but I think for the populace at large, that's not a common way of seeing it. But I think we are going through a transition where we're beginning to understand that the goal is to achieve enlightenment or achieve some type of spiritual clarity, some spiritual communion, depth of spiritual communion, and then take that into our life inside time and space and literally bring heaven to earth, to bring the conditions of the radical joy and freedom of heaven into our earthly lives, and to continue then to refine the human experience here on this planet and elsewhere.
Wow, wow. I'm going to read out something I've heard you say elsewhere that really grabbed me. Everybody experiences the soul when they die, but I think we're in the process of giving birth to humanity who's experiencing the soul fully when they're alive on Earth. And to what evidence do you think we have that there's something unique about the time that we're living in, where in this particular century, this new consciousness might be being birthed into the world?
Well, I'm not going to answer that question as an academic who has digested a lot of, sources of information. One could. I mean, anthropologists can consult indigenous cultures who have a certain vision of history that this is a particular time. We could look at Hindu sources, which talks about the Kali Yuga, which is a time of intense purification, which is immediately before a time of cultural breakthrough and spiritual breakthrough. I'd rather answer this just on the basis of my own psychedelic experience because I'm more confident drawing on that. And in my work, uh, I went through a series of experiences that changed my understanding of what the purpose of reincarnation is and where reincarnation is taking us. As I said, I have knowledge of about a dozen of my former lives. I did that during the 6 years when I was off, not doing the psychedelic work. I did some past life therapy work. So I had some familiarity with my deep past. But in a particular session, about halfway through my journey, I had a very deep experience when my former lives began to come into me. It was like wrapping a string around a kite spool. And these lives were just coming into me very fast. And then they seemed to hit critical mass and they fused. And when they fused into one, I experienced an explosion of diamond light coming out of my chest. And I was catapulted into a radical state of consciousness beyond anything I had known before, in which I was an individual. I wasn't Chris Bache, but I was an individual. But I was an individual beyond any parameters I'd ever known before. And I think what I experienced is what I call the diamond soul. And that is the soul, which is the complete integration, healthy, well integrated, balanced integration of all of one's former lives, so deeply that they fuse into a single entity. And this is what I mean of as the soul, or the diamond soul. Now, I think if things go well, when we die, we return to our soul. And then when we incarnate, a part of that energy incarnates as the individual incarnation. And when we die, we return to our soul and come back, return to the soul and come back. And so I think we do experience the soul more commonly after our deaths and before our incarnation. But if we think of this pulsing taking place over and over and over again, over thousands and hundreds of thousands of years, I think it begins to sort of make more sense that sooner or later in the evolutionary journey, the process of evolution itself is to foster a maturational development so that we grow into and as our soul on earth in our incarnations, that we literally live in a state of consciousness where we're no longer tempted to identify as just this body. We know that the consciousness that this body carries is older than this physical body and will continue longer than this physical body. And I think basically as it was laid out for me in my sessions, as the story of humanity's spiritual development was unfolded in my sessions, I think we're coming into a time where the challenge is literally to grow up. The challenge is to grow up psychologically, spiritually, and to claim the deeper being that we are. And Chris Bache is only one incarnation of my soul. And the goal is to wake up to the soul, not only to establish communion with it and to receive guidance from it, but literally, eventually, to incarnate the soul in your physical incarnation. I think this is where our entire species is going. I think we're coming to a crescendo in our spiritual journey. And in this crescendo, there is a tremendous upgrowth coming underneath us that's taking humanity into a fundamental change of our psychological condition. This is a change which is affecting the substructure of the psyche, the collective psyche. It's not just an individual personal thing. It's a collective thing. It's an evolutionary pivot that we're making. I think we are waking up spiritually and becoming what I would call diamond souls on earth. Now, a lot of people have this intuition. They've seen it. They've experienced it. They use different names they have different words for it. They talk about Homo spiritualis or Homo noeticus, different nomenclature. But I think all of us are seeing the same thing, a shift in our baseline consciousness from one level into a higher level, a permanent shift in consciousness, so that all human beings born after this shift takes place will be born and operating within a different collective psyche than our ancestors have been. And I don't think this is a shift which is going to be quick, going to happen, suddenly, dramatically. I think it's going to take multiple generations for us to make this transition, and it will be preceded by great purification. Just like when an individual mystic, before they achieve mystical realization, they go through what some have called the dark night of the soul, which is a time of profound cleansing, purification, confronting one's personal shadow, healing it, so on and so forth. I think we're going through now, we are beginning the dark night of our collective soul, in which we are confronting the sins of our fathers and mothers. We are our fathers and mothers. We're confronting the deep historical inadequacies, unhelpful tendencies, harmful tendencies, the things we've done in the past. Those are coming up very, very strongly in the collective psyche. We have to see this through to its full conclusion so that we can cooperate with the very powerful spiritual energies that are increasing underneath us at this time in history.
It seems like we've been running on momentum from the past, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of generations, iterations, and it's this habit energy. And we're finally at a time now as individuals where we have the capacity to be a, to be aware of that conditioning, to be aware of those patterns, and in some cases break them. You know, what a tremendous responsibility to place on somebody. But yeah, an interesting time to be alive. There's something else I wanted to ask you earlier and I forgot, but while I have you, just um,
I completely agree with you. It's a very exciting time to be alive, a very powerful time to be alive. Yeah.
okay, not an easy question or a light question to end on, but wondering about the problem of evil, and specifically, let's say someone like a Hitler or a Stalin. Um, in the afterlife, after a life like that ends, what do you think might happen to someone like that?
Yeah. I want to be careful because I don't want to indulge in a speculative answer. And inevitably, this involves a certain measure of speculation. You're talking about kind of human individuals who are so distorted in their heart and in their mind that we would call them bad or evil. And then there's a second layer to your question: is there a cosmic principle of evil? Now, I don't believe there's a cosmic principle of evil, but there is a cosmic principle of inertia. And if there is in us something which draws us to higher potentials and deeper realization, there is also a force in nature which kind of pulls us down into the lower side of our potential. I don't think of that as evil. Some might, and okay, if you want to call it evil, I would just call it the regressive side of the tension of our developmental capacity. What happens to individuals who have done so much damage to other individuals, who, in exalting themselves, have hurt the lives of thousands, of millions of people? Well, here I would turn to Michael Newton. And Michael Newton, in his book Destiny of Souls, his first book was Journey of the Soul, or Journey of Souls. Second book, Destiny of Souls. He describes in more detail what happens to individuals who have given themselves over to malice, injury, those type of things. And he says they require special handling because they are so distant. They have pulled away so far from their divine center, because when we are near the divine center, it's a place of deep and profound compassion. It's the divine center is the touchstone of oneness. With oneness comes compassion, comes an all-inclusiveness. So someone who is pathological or malevolent in history is very far away from their divine center and therefore requires special handling when they die in order to handle the damage which they've done to themselves and to the people around them. Now, one simple way of understanding what happens to us when we die, and I draw this from looking at near-death episode literature, when people experience the life review, when people have the experience of their life review, they not only experience every second, every intention, every thought of their entire life, but they experience how those actions and how those thoughts impacted those around them. So someone who is in a fist fight experiences how the other person experienced being beaten up and what it did to their psyche, and what happened when they brought that anger home. People who are in war, who have assassinated people, experience in their life review what that assassination did to the history of the family that was without a father from that point on. So one way of thinking about this is if you just take a big rock and throw it into a lake and the ripples spread out, our life is like that. We send ripples out into the world. What happens when we die is that all those ripples come back to us and we experience the full social impact of our life, not to punish us and not even to reward us, but because fundamentally, at core, life is one. And if you have lived your life according to that value and have tried to be good and careful and kind and compassionate to people, you send out this wave of goodness. It comes back to you and you experience the bliss, what we would call heaven, or the bliss of one's spiritual well-being. If you've done evil and harm and injury, then that comes back to you as well. And can you imagine what it would be like to be Hitler and experience the pain that you saw, that you caused, coming back to you? And that's why beings like this require special handling as they go through this adjustment process. He even goes so far to say that some beings cannot be restored to an operational, a healthy balance in their psyche. And those beings are sometimes recycled in a more radical way to an earlier stage of their soul's spiritual evolution and begun again. So it's a complicated topic, but you get the basic idea.
Wow, that's a really, really well articulated point of view to a very difficult question. So thank you for that. Chris, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. Really, really enjoyed this. For anybody that wants to dive deeper into your work after this, where would you send them to learn more?
Well, they could go to the website, my website, chrisbache.com. It's kind of old and not up to date, but there's some information there. You'll see my books there. I've done maybe 85 or so, 90 podcasts and talks that are online. So it's not hard to find me. If you just Google me on YouTube, you'll find places where I've given these types of discussions and talks. There's a talk on the scientific evidence for reincarnation that I gave in Germany a few years back. They're different talks, but the most important thing I think would be to jump into my books. There have been 4 books: Life Cycles on Reincarnation, Dark Night, Early Dawn, which is when I first started writing on psychedelic experiences. Then there's a book called The Living Classroom, which describes how my secret work, which my students never knew about, how it began to impact them. So it's about the distributed effect of one's spiritual practices. And then lastly, and maybe most importantly, LSD in the Mind of the Universe.
Fantastic. Okay. Thank you so much, Chris. And I wish you the best going forward.
Yeah, I enjoyed our conversation very much. Thank you very much. It's been an honor.
If you enjoyed this episode, you might also enjoy getting our 7 Insights newsletter. This is a once per month email where I share 7 of the most valuable insights I've uncovered in the previous 30 days. It includes book, podcast, and documentary recommendations, as well as questions and quotes specifically curated to help you live a more creative, intentional, and meaningful life. It currently goes out to over 50,000 subscribers each month. And if you're interested in joining them, you can sign up via the link in the description.